Let's get started. It's the time around. Cool. As you all have already seen, the topic for my session would be more around shared calling. Most of us already know what is shared devices or what shared device licenses is, and this topic or this feature is more different than what shared devices is. And how this can be leveraged with shared devices as well. We'll talk about all those things in the session altogether. So my name is Satish Upadhyaya. I work at Software Communication Inc. as a Microsoft 365 architect. Some of my social handles, in case if you want to reach out after the session, I would be here as well if you have any questions as well. Thank you to all the sponsors, including the platinum sponsors, gold sponsors, and digital sponsors, as well as the silver sponsors. Without them, the event would have not been possible. Most of them have their booths in the exhibition halls. Would highly recommend everyone to go visit at least and thank them for helping us in setting up this event altogether. And also to the organizer, without them the event would have not been possible as well. I'll keep it brief, small introduction, and then we'll go into the agenda, what all topics we would be covering up, and then we'll open up for question and answers as well. So something about me: I've been working with a lot of state and local government in the States and in Canada. Have been working with multinational companies across different regions, helping them roll out Teams Voice, slowly and gradually going into the Copilot space, which Microsoft is coming into, Teams Premium, helping customers get those value out of those licenses purchases as well. Most of my experience is around the telecom side of the business, so I help customers deploy Teams in countries like India, China, Middle East, where telco regulations are more strict in terms of how Teams or how PSTN can be leveraged in those countries as well. Brief agenda: what we would be talking about, what Microsoft Teams shared calling is, what the functionality looks like, how the call flow works, both inbound, outbound, how your 911 would work, because in states 911 is really critical. So we'll talk about those tips and tricks, what features are available, which country features are available, and which countries this is not there, or which operators are supporting it, which direct routing partners are supporting it. We'll talk about those, and some common troubleshooting issues that when we set up for some customers, what we ran into altogether. Some kind of an overview where most of us know this, but just wanted to give you one thing. You have users, rooms, and shared devices on the top, and then your connectivity options are: you can use the PSTN via the Microsoft calling plan, via the operator connect, you can use direct routing, or you can use Teams Phone Mobile or Teams Phone Calling as an option as well. So we'll talk about all four ways how we would be able to use shared calling using all those different methods, and how the functionalities would look like as well when you are using or enabling up the shared calling capabilities. Not restricted that you need to be an E5 customer or you need to have E5 licenses only, then you would have it. You can have E1, E3, any licenses, F3, F5 on the frontline worker space, A3, A1, A5, anything on those licenses, you can leverage Teams shared calling capabilities. So we have been talking about shared calling. Let's look at what is Teams shared calling capability is all about. So in Teams shared calling capability, you give one DID to n number of users. The max n number of user is in one policy would be 10,000. So one DID that can be shared among 10,000 different users that enables them to make outbound calls. How the inbound call would work? The inbound call would come on the IVR, and from there either we would use the dial by name or dial by extension capability, and the call would reach the end user. So both your inbound calling and outbound calling works seamlessly. You have a feature. What is the benefit of shared calling? There should be some reason why the feature was introduced. Why would you use shared calling as a capability? Now, when you assign DID to every user, if you're giving Microsoft calling plan, you need to purchase calling plan for every individual users. With shared calling, you don't assign that calling plan to the user, you assign it to your resource account. So for 10,000 users, you can have one calling plan, but the Teams phone system licenses is required for all your users. So Teams phone system add-on would still be required, but you reduce your cost or you optimize your cost without the requirement of the calling plans for every user. I'm using 10,000. 10,000 is the max number that you can restrict the overall user count. Go ahead.
When you say shared calling, are you saying one number assigned to multiple user accounts in Teams, or are you saying one number assigned to the same user that's signed in multiple phones at the same time?
No, so it's one number. So the question is whether when we talk about shared calling, is that one number assigned to multiple users, or is it one user that is signed into multiple accounts? So it is one number that is shared among 10,000 different user accounts, and those user accounts would have their own individual logins. So that's how the shared calling capability is. Yeah. Any other questions before we move? Okay. So we'll look at all the configurations, how we would set the shared calling capabilities with direct routing, with operator connect. So we'll look at all those things as well. With shared calling, do I lose any feature? No. With shared calling, you get all those features that you are getting when you have a DID assigned to your account. It is just that you are having one number that is shared among the multiple users. You can make outbound calls, you can receive inbound calls, you can dial 911, you can call any number, you can receive your voicemails. Everything works in a similar way. You can delegate features also. So delegation also works here in these options as well. Now, why shared calling? Why Microsoft came up this functionality of shared calling? So the interesting fact about that is customers have purchased E5 licenses, but they have not enabled those. So that is one of the reason. The functionality of shared calling was available in direct routing since the inception itself. Just for calling plans and operator connect, the functionality came in recently and customers are able to use it. When you have Teams phone system license, why don't you enable it? Enable the user to be making and receiving the inbound call. Now, in most of the organization, people are not making that much volume of outbound calls. So for them, this is one of the critical things that can help you optimize your cost. You don't need an on-prem resources, you don't need an on-prem Cisco environment, or you don't need to have a third-party PBX that is hosted somewhere, and you can have all the functionality that you use on a dedicated DID to be included into the Teams phone system. So we'll talk about call flows. Let's look at how your inbound and your outbound calls work as such, and then we'll talk about the 911 calling as well, how it would work. So let's talk about first the inbound call. Since you will have shared calling, your call would land on the auto attendant. Your main line number or your board line number is where your call would land. From there, the call would go to the respective user account which is mapped in that auto attendant. It could be one user, it could be 10 users, it could be 100 users, it could be 1000 users. Doesn't matter. It can support up to 10,000 users seamlessly. You can have same resource account shared with different shared calling policies that we would go into the live demo and look at. So you can have same resource account sharing those as well. Two options, dial by name or dial by extension. The functionality which auto attendant has, that's what you would be able to use when you have shared calling enabled. Outbound call, when you make the outbound call, it's a typical regular outbound call. You have your dial pad, you make the outbound call. The only difference here would be is when you make that outbound call, the caller ID which would be displayed would be your auto attendant or the board line number that you have configured. That is the auto attendant, or that is the number that you would be displayed when your outbound calls are made. Now, when I get an inbound call, one person answers it. Does it mean that I cannot take another inbound call? No. It can work simultaneously. You can have n number of calls coming in simultaneously. It could have 1,000 calls coming in at one go. It would support it seamlessly without any problems. So there is no challenges as such. Go ahead.
Is there a limitation on how many concurrent calls you can make at a time?
Depends upon your SIP circuit. So if you are using direct routing or if you are using operator connect from the partners, it depends upon how many concurrent calls you have purchased from them. So that is where it would come in. Go ahead.
On the resource account, can you assign a dial plan policy that allows it to do abbreviated to E164 conversions?
On the E164 format, no. For shared calling, no. That's not supported, but we'll also talk about the dynamic. There is a reason for that, and we'll also talk about the dynamic 911 capability with direct routing. There is a limitation on that as well, so we'll talk about those as well. So in terms of your SIP channel question, yes, if you are using direct routing or operator connect, depends upon how many SIP sessions you have purchased from the partner. Based on that much volume of calls it can support. To that point, not every operator connect partners are supporting it. There are a handful of them that are supporting it. So you have to reach out to your operator connect partner and check with them whether they support shared calling or not. So that's one thing that we need to be mindful of as well. Direct routing as well, in a similar situation, you have to be there. For calling plan, Microsoft right now offers calling plan in 35 countries, last being the Brazil edition that they had. So 35 countries that Microsoft is supporting the calling plans. Out of that, 7 countries is where they do not support shared calling, but they support shared calling in rest all 28 countries seamlessly. I have the list in my later slide deck as well, so we'll talk about those shortly. Any questions on the inbound and outbound calls? Go ahead.
So the outbound piece assigning different policies, calling or routing policies to different users. So you want to have some be able to call international, some just national only.
You can definitely restrict that. Yeah, you can do that. Not a problem on that side. Go ahead.
You had addressed inbound concurrent calls, and there's no limitations or constraints. But what about outbound?
Same thing. Whatever happens on inbound, the same thing applies for your outbound calls as well. The number of concurrent calls you have from your carrier, it totally supports on that one. Go ahead.
Can your user participate in shared calling and have a DID?
No. No. When you have shared calling, it's different, and when you have a dedicated DID assigned, it's typically the DID that you have. The only thing that you would be able to do when you have a dedicated DID is you can do a pay-as-you-go subscription on that side. Go ahead.
So, I mean, default to the question that you just asked, I mean, if you had a user with a personal DID number assigned, and that user assigns the member to a call queue, right? They could have both a personal number ring and a call queue ring, in different scenarios.
But when it comes down to shared calling, it's not part of a call queue. Shared calling is from a part of your auto attendant, not calling queues. Correct. Correct. So it's a bit different when you are using call queues versus your auto attendant.
But what if you assign a different number to the auto attendant? That would still allow you to get calls from the auto attendant and personal calls to your
But when you have shared calling and a DID assigned to a user account, your existing DID would take precedence over your shared calling policy. Because when you have shared calling policy assigned, you don't see DID assigned to a user account in the dial pad. Okay, so that's major reason. Go ahead.
So can those users, like a subset of the users and the shared calling, can they be parts of call queues?
Absolutely, they can be a part of call queues seamlessly because they are enterprise voice enabled. They can definitely be a part of your call queues and have those functionality work seamlessly as well. Go ahead.
The private line thing be allowed in this scenario, like they were saying?
No.
Calling, not being
No.
able to do it.
No, you won't be able to do private line capability here on the shared calling user that's enabled as such.
Can you assign a private number to the resource account?
Private number to a resource account.
Resource account's tied to that number. Because that's going with the calling plan.
No, you can't do that as well. Go ahead.
On the topic, can multiple phone numbers address the same list of shared callers?
No, when you are having one user or one user account, you can have one shared calling policy assigned. You can't have multiple shared calling policies assigned to one user.
You can assign multiple numbers to the same resource account.
You can assign that. So when we get into the demo, you'll be able to understand why I'm coming back to that point that you can't have multiple numbers. So we'll talk about those demos into as well. Now, Satish, you said 10,000 users having one single DID. When they dial 911, what happens? And to the extent they dial 911, okay, call goes out, outbound call works, all good. 2 minutes down the line, call gets disconnected. How would the PSAP call back? Because it was a shared calling number. So it would hit the auto attendant, correct? So in shared calling, there is a concept of emergency callback number. So you have to define an emergency callback number in the shared calling policy. Not a mandatory thing, but recommended from Microsoft to have emergency callback number. There is a ratio for that. Nothing coming in from Microsoft, but then we have seen that if you have 100 user in the organization, you should at least have one emergency callback number in there that should be there. You can have multiple, not a problem. So when a user dials 911, in that case, an emergency callback number gets assigned from that pool to that user for 60 minutes. For next 60 minutes, that emergency callback number would be dedicated to that user. So if the call gets disconnected and the PSAP needs to call it back, in that scenario, that emergency callback number would be used and the call would not go via auto attendant. The call would hit the user directly on their Teams client. So that's how your emergency callback capability is enabled. Now, we talked about shared calling, we talked about Microsoft calling plans. Now, one thing to note here is the 120 minutes or the 300 minutes or 3000 minutes calling plan are not assigned to this shared calling capability. You have to assign a mandatorily pay-as-you-go license to shared calling users. That's a mandate when you are doing calling plans. So when you're doing a calling plan setup, you need to assign the Teams resource account license and the pay-as-you-go license to the account, not the 120 minutes or 3000 minutes, and there is a reason for that. Why? Because if your users are making calls, Let's even take 10 users who are making outbound calls, and if they make 10 minutes of call in a day, your 100 minutes are wiped off within a day. So that is the only reason why pay as you go is is a mandate when you are using the Microsoft calling plan. If you are using direct routing, you get those minutes from your carrier. If you're using Operator Connect, again you get those minutes from your carrier as well. You can only use pay as you go licenses with shared calling.
Does your,
Go ahead.
their emergency pool, does that show up, if you're using calling plans, does that show up in your voice list under numbers or not?
In my Teams client?
Yeah.
No.
If you attack and you look, and those are your emergency numbers, they're not showing up as valid numbers in your tenant, correct?
It has to be a valid number into your tenant. It has to show up in your tag.
They don't show up under phone numbers, do they, in your tenant? Or
It would show up in your
can't assign.
You can't assign. If it is part of your emergency calling policies here, you won't be able to assign that number to anyone else. So we'll look at all those things. Any questions before we get into demo? Go ahead.
Functional question on the 911 pool. If we have an event occur and our pool is 5 numbers deep and 6 people call emergency services, do we cycle back to the first number?
We do cycle back to the first number.
So it overrides.
Correct. Go ahead.
For when somebody places that 911 call, I'm assuming at the time they place the call, it temporarily assigns a number, and that's the number that is then sent to the PSAP. Right?
Correct.
So that way the PSAP's not, they're just seeing that temporarily assigned call.
Correct. They'll see the temporarily assigned callback number. They'll get the PID flow information. All those information that is that is sent like a regular 911 call would be shown in that call to the PSAP. Now, I just want to I'll just want to highlight one thing for 911. And when you are using direct routing as a service, whether it is your hosted, whether it is carrier hosted, when you are using 911 with direct routing, there is a concept of network information that you upload, and when your users are moving from New York to Toronto or from Toronto to San Francisco, any of your location gets updated automatically. Those functionality, if your users are part of those functionality, they should not be enabled with shared calling. The reason for that is shared calling policy with the emergency location that it has in direct routing, it would override that. So that setup is not recommended from Microsoft as of now. They have not figured out how they'll be supporting it, but that's one setup that they don't recommend when you're using 911. Go ahead.
It seems like the shared calling scenario and the licensing associated with that is an alternative method of having multiple people ring when one number is dialed or when one number is accessed from the outside. Why would they choose to deploy that scenario versus just building an auto attendant with a resource account and then dial the name without?
This would not ring multiple people at one time. When your inbound call comes in, it goes to a specific user whom you are calling for, because you are using dial by name and dial by name, or you are using dial by extension capability.
What is the I guess what I'm asking is, what does the shared license enable that's not there by default for those same users? What are they getting by having that turned on?
Oh.
So some companies, for example, like traditional PBX, like Buy or something, a lot of users, they don't give VIPs, they give parent extensions. So but they have the ability to call out.
Okay.
And what happens is someone will, if they want to receive a call, someone will call the main desk and say, hey, I need to reach,
I'll give you some more examples. Let's take an example of a retail workflow. I have my frontline workers licenses that we have, and they majorly take inbound calls. They don't make that much number of outbound calls. Those scenario is where your shared calling would fit in. because you don't have to pay for every user on the outbound calling capability. They would make like one call in a whole month, or it could be one call in a week. You save those costs there. And then the better functionality or the better part is, since you own the phone system license, you enable the user, you are compliant by your 911 regulations like the Carey's laws and the RABAMS Act as well, where 911 outbound calls are going as well. So that is the major reason why the shared calling is one of the things that everyone has been talking all about. Let's get into the demo of, so let's look at one, sorry. So let's look at one user profile. So this is how you would see a user profile that has a shared calling enabled. You would see users showing as a phone number type coming in from shared calling. Resource account is what you would be using for shared calling. What is the voice app that is being used, and what is the number that is assigned to that resource account. So you would see that, and then you would be able to, as an administrator, you would be able to see what numbers are there in the emergency callback number as well. Note, you won't see emergency address because emergency address would be coming in from the shared calling policy. Earlier, before the shared calling capability came into Teams Admin Center, this was being rolled out using PowerShell, which was a cumbersome process. You had to have the object ID, you needed to have those DIDs there. So having Teams Admin Center and having those policies here is really important, and it's really helpful as well. So when you look at this shared calling policy that I have created, so I have a custom shared calling policy. So this I have created for my New York office, but if you look at my emergency address, I'm using a Toronto address. So that's incorrect. It has to be the same country and same emergency location needs to be defined. This is the place where I define my number. The number is already, it's a part of my, that's already defined in my auto attendant, but when you assign a number to a shared calling capability, even with Microsoft calling plan, you need to ensure that that TID or that number has a valid emergency location defined. If you don't have a valid emergency location defined, it will throw you an error that this number is not supporting shared calling. Go ahead.
Are you able to assign at a more granular level places within those emergency addresses, or is it just an emergency address and the place assignment?
It's an emergency address. You can still use the places within the emergency address. That is still available. That's not a problem.
Okay.
I'm going to ask a dumb question.
Go ahead.
To clarify. Based on what I'm hearing, we can only apply shared calling plans to physically contiguous locations. Okay.
Yes.
And since you can only have be a member of one shared calling plan, your shared calling plans are then constrained to a physical emergency response location.
Correct. Although it's constrained to a physical emergency location, but you can still have it when you're using it with Microsoft calling plan or even with your operator connect capability. It can be a part, like if I have a user based in New York, and that user is traveling to, let's take in to go to Dallas, to the Dallas office, and the user is updating the emergency location manually into that Teams application, you can still use it.
But it requires a manual update from the end user.
Correct. It requires a manual update because that paid flow information, what the end user dials in or types in, would go there. Go ahead.
So, kind of piggybacking off that same question, if you had an office building with like 3 floors, and you wanted those 3 floors to be presented uniquely within the emergency response center or whatever, you'd have to create 3 shared calling policies, 1 for each floor.
Correct.
Right? And
Correct.
Each one would have their own unique location and place assignment.
Correct.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The LIS address, if a user matches to the LIS database, is that overriding
Correct. It would override it. The only time it does not override is when you're using the direct routing automatic mapping. That's the only place where it does not override it. And Microsoft is working on getting that part looked up as well. So the shared calling policy, if you look at it, I can go here. Majorly depends upon what resource account you would be using, what's your emergency callback number. That's the two major thing that you would be using. I have shared calling here, so I have an auto attendant created for this. So this is what my auto attendant number. So the number that you were seeing there, it's coming in from this shared call, what number that I have assigned here. To your question, coming back, can I have multiple resource account assigned? You can have it, but the first one would be the only one that it would take up for, because in shared calling it's highly recommended you use only one number for shared calling capability. How your inbound calls would be coming in? Your inbound calls would come in by these two features, dial by name or dial by extension. Now coming back to this feature, dial by name, dial by extension, if you are having 5 people with the same name, your dial by name feature would not work. So in that case, it's recommended to you define the dial scope and ensure you have an Office 365 group associated with that, so that all the users of that group can be searched as well. Dial by extension, you need to have unique extension. Go ahead, sir.
Instead of using dial by name, could you pass that to a receptionist and let them field the calls instead? Or do you have to use the dial by name?
You can definitely pass on to the receptionist, but then it also depends upon how many users you are having in that. If you have 10,000 users, receptionists would be blown away with the number of calls you would be getting in as well. Yeah, that's in terms of anything. Now, any questions on the tenant side specifically? Go ahead.
Just one more question. On the extensions, you said you dial extensions on the hours to the user. Where is the extensions provisioned in the Teams tenant?
So that's not provision onto the tenants. So when you define when you enable the user on the enterprise voice side, that's where you define the same extension capability, the same number that you'll have, and then you can have an extension based on that. That extension has to be unique, and that extension gets mapped into your Azure AD or Entra ID basically, and from there it pulls up the extension when the dial by extension capability is used.
Extension Microsoft 365 Admin Center 1911.
Correct.
Thanks.
Because at the end of the day, it's just the fake extension that we have been keeping in, and the same extension capability which was available in Avaya, and Cisco does it, all the other platform does it. Microsoft needs to support it as well. So that was one of the major reason when this functionality came in. Going back to the benefits, so if you're starting up with a new location, you want to roll it out very quick, or you need to get rid of your contracts, you can do this. You can get rid of your contracts very soon as well. If you want to test the capability, you want to do the pilot as such, at that time also you can use it. One of the other use cases is where you are having Teams room licenses and your common area phones or shared devices phone, you can use it there as well, where you can give the shared calling capabilities to all those rooms seamlessly as well. Like the last point says, it can be scalable up to 10,000 users with one single shared calling policy. The same shared calling policy can again be used with another 10,000 users, so that should not be a challenge supporting multiple users. Like I mentioned, for Operator Connect, you need to check with your Operator Connect partners whether they support shared calling or not. That's one. For Microsoft calling plan, this is the list of countries where Microsoft calling plans do not support shared calling. Romania, Czech Republic, Hungary, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia and Japan. Australia and Japan I can understand because they are doing it with the local carriers there, KDDI and Telstra. In other countries it is because their back-end telcos are not supporting it. That's the major reason why they have to do that. When you're doing shared calling capability, one more catch there is there are certain countries, or in certain countries like in Germany, what we have found that you cannot assign emergency location to a phone number. In those cases you have to open up a service request with the number porting team, which assigns those emergency locations from the back end. So that's another thing that we need to be mindful of as well when you are creating those configurations as well. Any other things? With shared calling, I did say we would require a pay-as-you-go communication credit license would be required. If your communication credit license or the wallet does not have enough fund, your outbound calls would fail. Your inbound calls would still work all fine. Now, any questions?
What was that last part? If it's not funded, they won't work. But what was the last
Outbound calling would stop working, and it would the inbound would work all good. Okay, yeah, outbound would stop working. There are certain countries where you would not be able to use shared callings, countries in Asia Pacific region where you need to have dedicated DIDs assigned to those users. You cannot use shared calling in those countries, but there is no predefined list of countries that you have. Any questions? Go ahead.
On that top one, you said you could use the same resource account on different sharing calling policies.
Correct.
So if you're assigning that to different ones and you're limiting, what they can call, is that, if you're
No.
Your search, or you're just limiting the policies?
So I'm talking about this one here. So in my shared calling policy, I have New York office and I have a resource account used here. I can use the same resource account for my Dallas location as well. So it does not have to have, you can have.
You're using that resource account, right? It's on a number, and that comes in to that one number.
Correct.
To sharing, right?
Correct.
So if you were going to limit that using a group, right? For
your search basis, you can definitely add the same group. You have to add both the groups into that. Correct. Yeah. Go ahead.
Can you do a toll-free number on the shared calling?
You can. Go ahead.
So in the, you said if the calling plan isn't funded, inbound will still work, but outbound gets shut off?
Yeah.
Does it also shut off emergency calls to 911?
No. 911 calls will still work.
I just want to make sure.
Cool. Before I wrap, one small trick that I always give out in almost of my session is, and it could be a question as well for you all. Now, the calls are coming in via auto attendant. Okay. Now, if you remember, I said if you are using dial by name capability, you can define the dial by name by group. But if that group is not defined, be mindful, any user in your organization can be searched irrespective they are enabled for enterprise voice or not. Okay?
Does that include if you already have informational barriers set between, like,
Yes, it does include those users. So you can search any user in the organization that have the user configured. So you don't require to have a phone system license when you are taking inbound calls only. Okay, The only time you need the Teams phone system add-on license is when you're making the outbound calls. Okay, so that's one small catch, or when the small functionality that allows your users to receive inbound calls. Similarly, when you are using call queues, you have an option of doing channels. You have an option of when you select the agent type, in that instead of selecting agent by agent, you can use a channel, a Teams channel. So whoever is a part of that Teams channel can receive calls. The same functionality.
I'm sorry. Restate it again.
Which one? The call queue?
Teams channel, the inbound call.
Correct. So when the call comes in a call queue number, so your call would come on a call queue. In call queue, you defined who would be my agents. You can define agents by group, you can define agents by individual agent type, and the third option is you can define agent by call queue options, like by channels. So you can define Teams channel there, and whoever is a part of the Teams channel becomes your contact center or your agent as such. Irrespective whether that user has Teams phone system license, they can still receive inbound calls, but they can't make outbound calls. So that's two important tweaks that works seamlessly right now. Microsoft is aware they can't do anything around those two functionalities as such. It's a functionalities that are available and people can and organizations are using it seamlessly as such. That's it, nothing else from my end. Go ahead.
You mentioned that you can assign the same resource account to multiple shared calling policies. There doesn't seem to be a lot that you can configure in those shared calling policies. So what's the use case for using the same resource account? Can you assign a different emergency address for the same resource account in different policies? So is there a use case for using the same resource account?
So that use case is, let's take an example. If I have more number of users in the same organization, in same location, and I cannot fit in that 10,000 user bucket, I can use that. That's one. The second thing is I want to save more on the cost perspective on getting those numbers, although when you're using calling plans or such, your numbers are free ultimately, and the calls can still route. You can use that same resource account number for making calls. Now, like I mentioned, when you're making outbound calls and your users have defined your emergency location and the PIT flow takes in those calls, it overrides your emergency location defined for shared calling policy. So if you have one office in Orlando and the other office is in Texas, you can have the same resource account, same number. It could be one single number that I'm using across different locations, and then the users can override the emergency location capability.
Because you're doing your due diligence for updating the LIS.
Correct, LIS. Now, for LIS, like you all know, there is a policy. You can have the external lookup mode enabled, and then you can give a disclaimer to the user that they need to put the location for having when the 911 call is being dialed.
But your emergency address is assigned to the actual shared policy, not to the resource. So that's where you can have the two. You have one balance.
Your emergency location is not mapped to your policy. It's mapped to your DID.
Okay.
It's always mapped to your DID.
It's like, so I'm just thinking it's
Correct. So it's always mapped to your DID, and without which you would not be able to leverage the capability of shared calling. Go ahead.
When you say that Microsoft's aware of the inbound is available without that license, that sort of sounds like that they're going to.
I don't think so. No, things or feature have been enabled. It's available for OCS days. They haven't fixed it till now. Then they won't be looking at it for a long time. Go ahead.
Is it possible to block incoming calls for a specific number? So, for example, the football team does something really bad, and they all want to call the president to say, we're displeased with your football team. If the president doesn't want those calls.
Absolutely. Has an individual user account, you can definitely block any calls, any DIDs that you want. you have those capabilities. What you have as a regular DID assigned user, you can still block calls. Now, if I want to exclude certain users from being searchable from that auto attendant, you can exclude those users as well. I don't want my president to be included in that auto attendant search, I can definitely exclude him. Not a problem. Cool. That's it. All good. On time. Thank you.